Everyone, good morning. This is the Cloak and Dagger Weekly Briefing. I'm with Albert Marco and special guest Ralph Schulhammer. Um, we are talking through several items this week around trade. Of course, we can't avoid trade. We're looking at Trump's approval rating, and we're also looking at the India-Pakistan issue, which is a huge issue that has gotten some coverage in the West, but to be honest, not as much as it probably warrants. So I want to kind of dig pretty deep into that. Ralph, welcome. I'm so glad that you're with us and you could join us. Um, Ralph, so I saw this morning. So there's the Pope's funeral. Has been the Pope's funeral in Rome today, and I saw just about 30 minutes ago that von der Leyen said she would meet with Trump. Um, Tell me about that. What? I feel like Europe is in a position where they've been very dismissive of Trump and very dismissive of US concerns. So, what do you think will happen with that? Do you think Europe will try to kind of present Trump, continue to present Trump as stupid, as the trade war, as not necessary, all this stuff? How will she approach this, and what do you think will come of it?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, and I'll try to kind of
Yeah.
condense this into a few bullet points. So the biggest problem I see that Europe at the moment has is they look at this whole thing as if they are a player at the table, when in truth, at least for now, I would argue that the Europeans are a piece on the chessboard. And I think this is one of the misunderstandings the Europeans have. So the choice they have is not the Macron vision of being an autonomous quasi third superpower with the United States and China. Basically, at this point in time, the only choice the Europeans can make or the EU can make is either to side with the United States or with China, which I believe, and we can talk about this in greater detail. I can sense, and I mean, I'm following you guys' Patreon account very closely. I'm following everything that Albert is writing on X. I'm
Thank
following
you
you,
for the
Tony.
plug.
No, it's great. And one issue I have is that I think the current US administration, if one is so deep in geopolitics as you guys are, you can see the pattern emerge, but they have been horribly in communicating it. Because I think if you look at the bigger picture and you don't just look at it from a purely economic perspective, but from a geopolitical or geostrategic perspective, I think a lot of what the United States are attempting to do makes sense. It will come with economic pain, I believe, but there is a method to the madness. But the way in which they're communicating it, both I think to the own electorate and to the rest of the world, that has not been very effective, I have to admit. I think one could have said openly, the way in which trade is currently organized is not going to work in the kind of competition we believe we are in with China. That there
Okay,
need to be certain,
let's go
yeah.
back to that. I want to go back to that broader point, but you mentioned some interesting about Europe. They can either side with the US or they can side with China. If they decide to side with China, what does that look like? I mean, it's
Well,
kind of Germany fast forwarded, right?
yeah. I
Germany's
mean,
outsourced their industrial capacity to China, and it's just Germany fast forwarded, right?
you all should know this. There's always these memes, right, where it's like two guys, and below it says "choose your champion," or this kind of this very popular meme. And I think in the European case, it's not so much choose your champion; it's more choose your antagonist. Because one thing the Europeans, I believe, are still underestimating is that if you side with China, you risk that the United States will behave antagonistically. If you side with the United States, you risk that China is going to behave antagonistically. Now, the issue I see, and we discussed on so many shows, the three of us, this on so many occasions, but there still is, this sounds like cheap Euro bashing, but I think it is still true, that the Europeans still have trouble fully grasping the reality on the ground. And what I mean by this is, for example, von der Leyen is meeting Trump. But while she's meeting Trump, the European Union is also putting, not tariffs, but punitive or retaliatory payments on Meta and US tech concerns. And this is a little bit, I would argue, poking the United States in the eye. Then you have BMW saying that they're going to integrate Huawei technology and DeepSeek technology into their cars. And we'll see what other European companies are going to do. And that's a bit the issue. So it's not just about, oh, Trump is having a bad day, so we just have to pat him on the shoulder and things will go back to how they were in the 90s, early 2000s. The United States want to rearrange global trade. At least that's my assessment. And I think one of the things they will attempt to do is say who's with us and who is against us. This position of neutrality that consists of, as it was before the Ukraine-Russian war, energy from Russia, export markets in the United States, and production in China. That's no longer going to work, right? I mean, it was a great time. It worked very well for a long time. And I think Europeans are starting to realize, or they will have to realize, that this is no longer going to work. And one major issue, and I'm not sure if von der Leyen knows this, and I mean, Albert, you've been talking about this, I would say, for at least 10 years. Are they aware to what extent, for example, the European financial system depends on the United States? I think there is still not a full realization. If the United
Nope.
States, for whatever reason, wants to inflict pain on Europe, they can do it much, much more, I think, than is generally realized.
Oh yeah. So, Albert, before you jump in, I just want to frame this up a little bit because all your points, Ralph, are well noted and well taken. I'll take a little bit of the other side of that. So I'm going to take the other side of an argument with Albert later on, but I'll take a little bit of the other side of that in as much as Trump talked about this on the campaign trail for a year.
Oh,
And
Trump, can I intersect real quick?
yeah,
Trump was talking about this. I looked it up. I think in the Agenda 47, he talked about this in February 2023. So that these tariffs, at least the base tariffs of the 10% or 20%, whatever it's going to be, you're absolutely right. I mean, the real surprise here, I believe, is that Trump is actually doing what he said he's going to do
right.
during the campaign.
That's the surprise. Nobody
Yeah.
thought he would do it. The other part of this is you cannot change the status quo with incrementalism. I hear a lot of people say, oh, he's going too fast, he's doing too much. You have to create a sense of urgency. Otherwise, you'll be thrown into multilateral institutions for the next 10 years. And people will take a lot of nice holidays in, beach resorts or whatever. And the focus will be on tariffs because that's an easy thing for people to understand, but they'll never talk about non-tariff barriers. They'll never talk about subsidies. So I believe this has been put out to create a sense of urgency that causes real economic damage with trade partners. And of course, there's economic damage in the US. And again, the assertion is that that's short term. Albert, what I want to ask you about is we're seeing over the last week or so, we're seeing a lot of hype on social media about shortages and about containers arriving on the West Coast and about Americans need to be, terrified of the fallout of this come June or something like that. Do you think like, are we not going to have toilet paper in June?
No, I think the fears are vastly overblown. Of course, it's media, and people need clickbait headlines to sell their articles. But the reality is most of the retailers had bought oversupply in anticipation of the tariffs and whatnot. So they have stuff here for close to 12 months if they really need to. If trade goes to zero, which it's not, right? I mean, the containers are maybe like 60% empty or 64% down or whatever it was. And of course, there's going to be a little bit of a drop off, but it's going to be inflationary. And the biggest issue that the Fed is looking at and why they don't cut rates is because they know inflation is probably going to tick back up. And even the administration has signaled this multiple times, like, yeah, it might be some short-term pain, but long-term gain in the end with trade deals and whatnot. But I agree with Ralph. The messaging on both sides is just, for the Europeans, the Americans, the Chinese has just been just god awful. But it's squarely on Trump's shoulders. He's the one with the erratic tweets and not really concise of what he wants to say. And
Yep.
obviously there's like political and personal reasons why I think that's the case, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think he's playing to his base a lot, and we can get into that when we talk about his approval ratings. But I just want to make sure we understand and have a discussion about what the end game is, right? Because people are saying, this is crazy. What's the end game?
You,
My understanding of the end game is, of course, are you going to hollow out manufacturing in China? No. Are you
mhm,
going to hollow out manufacturing in Europe? No.
mhm.
But we all saw from the pandemic that supply chains are overly reliant on China. This is, this happened in 2007, 8, 9. Everyone said they're going to diversify their supply chains. This happened in 2014, 15. It happened in 2020. And the companies, because they're so short-termist, they never take the pain to re-engineer their supply chains. So Trump is forcing them to do that. So we have diversified supply chains. Do we want manufacturing in the US? Yes. But as we wrote on Cloak and Dagger, there is a generation of factory that's coming about that's an AI-driven factory. And
Mhm.
if the US misses that generation of factory technology, then we won't have anything for 20 years. Sorry, go ahead, Albert.
Yeah, see, there's a misconception about China that Americans suffer. They all think everyone thinks that China lives off exports, but that's outdated. Even if they need 7 to 8% rise in domestic consumption, it's easily doable for the Chinese, right? This is a positive for a rebalance deal ultimately, but it's hard to push around China going forward. So this trade rebalance had to get done at this point in time from the Trump administration, and the Europeans are going to have to make a decision of like where do they want to sit? Do they want to sit with the global superpower and the issuer of the reserve currency, or do they want to try their luck with China, who has consistently stolen their technology and used Europe as a dumping ground and taken their manufacturing sector completely away? I mean, they've infected all of Italy with Chinese factories with made in Italy labels,
Yeah.
but what does the Italian citizen get out of that? Absolutely nothing. And the same thing is going to happen in Germany. The same thing is going to happen in France. If the Europeans aren't careful, they're going to find themselves, second world status for the next generation.
So,
Yeah,
Albert, I like your point about China needing this. I want to come back to that. Ralph, do you think Albert's talked about Europe being a dumping ground? Do you think we see deflation in Europe, say at the end of Q2 or early Q3, because of the need for China to continue exporting things? Will we see deflation, at least or deflation, at least goods deflation in Europe because it becomes a dumping ground?
well, it depends. I mean, one of the just a couple of months ago, when the European Union published its new green industrial strategy, I forgot what the exact title was. Somewhere hidden within this document was a provision that said that about 40% of everything that is acquired and built under this new plan should be made in Europe. So, and Albert, you already mentioned this. The Europeans are no strangers to protectionism. I mean, it comes under quality controls, and our meat is so much better than American meat, and you pump your chicken full of chlorine and whatnot. I mean, I love American food. I'm there all the time. So, but these are just ways how you can protect your own market. But Albert, I think, has pointed towards quite fundamental and something else I believe is going on, which is that since the shale revolution that happened now over 10 years ago, the United States played sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, the global policeman because protecting shipping was particularly important also in the energy sector. That is no longer relevant, right? The United States, they sit on basically an unlimited supply of hydrocarbons. Combine it with Canada and Latin America, Argentina. Let's assume there might be at one day a regime change in Venezuela, and you can tap into that as well. The United States and the Western Hemisphere are entirely energy independent, bring manufacturing to Latin America and some other places. Of course, also as Albert and Tony, as you mentioned, also back to the United States. And you can make an economic sphere an America, so not the United States American, but a truly American, North and South American economic zone that probably can be quite wealthy and quite independent from the rest of the world. And if the Europeans would be smart and if they would see this, they would raise their hand and say, hey, can we join this kind of thing if you want as a kind of extension of this Western hemispheric new economic bloc. But I think that's where the journey is going. And if the United States would communicate this more effectively, right, there's a lot of sticks going around at the moment. At some point, I'd like to see a carrot.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's also remember some key basic fundamentals that the Europeans seem to forget is the U.S. In America, all of the America basically is food and water and energy independent. We don't need anything from anybody. The Europeans, on the other hand, are not. They need food. They need to import. They need fresh water, even for the manufacturing, not just for drinking, but for manufacturing. You need that. The Chinese are the same thing. They are not independent with food. They're restricted to imports for almost all of the food, right? Especially after the floods, where their topsoil was completely taken away. Major farmland lost. So these are components that, like, when you build a model for geopolitical risk, especially from the European side, you need to look at that. You need to understand what your basic fundamental security issues are, economically, politically, socially, and then go from there, right? And relying on China versus the United States would be catastrophic for them.
Yep. I want to go back to one thing real quickly before we move on to Trump's approval ratings. Albert, you said something very interesting about China needing to change their economy. I think that China actually isn't opposed to the discussion that's going on. It's being presented as a very antagonistic US-China discussion. But as you and I have said since November, we said China would be antagonistic to the US for 3 to 6 months, and then they would align. China knows that they need to have more domestic consumption. So if they can vilify Trump in the US as a catalyst to bring what they've been trying to bring about for 20 plus years, it's a very convenient kind of argument and diplomatic route to have, right? So am I wrong on that, or is that somewhere in the neighborhood of where we could be diplomatically?
No, that's correct. I mean, if you look at the what's happening in China, you see desperation in their factory and the manufacturing sector. They're completely empty. They're even going on TikTok and social media outfits trying to lure American buyers to buy their, Louis Vuitton and whatever else, out there that's obviously fake. So I think they have 3 to 6 months at most.
Right. And as I put out a note or a calculation a few weeks ago saying it's going to cost the Chinese government probably $30 billion a month to subsidize people. So that's not small money for China. It's not small money for anybody. We act like it is in the US, but it's not small money for anybody.
No, but just remember that China's recently devalued enough to do almost $2 trillion of stimulus, right? They've devalued. Which they'll do, and they can even up it to 3.5 trillion if they really need to.
Yep, which they'll do. Okay, so I want to move on to Trump's approval rating. So I've had a lot of people who, from my view, they love the status quo. Okay, they love the international order the way it is. They love markets the way they are. They have their algorithm, how to trade and make money and all this other stuff. So you have a lot of people in the investment space who are really kind of, angry about this. Okay. And so that's reflected a bit in Trump's approval rating. So Albert, can you talk us through that? So what's happening with Trump's approval ratings, and should he be worried?
He should be worried. I mean, midterms are really, the fundraising for midterms starts in about 3-4 months, right? And his approval ratings are directly correlated with the stock market, believe it or not. I mean, I know people don't want to believe that, or they say, stock market is only for the elite and so on and so forth. But you remember, 401ks are in there, pensions are in there. It makes a big difference, right? I have plenty of friends that are not, the 1%ers that, rely on some of these like stock moves, to generate extra income. And as his messaging has been completely erratic, like we've talked multiple times, right? Where the markets seem to be using his social media rhetoric as policy, which is hilariously stupid, by the way. Mm-hmm. These drastic moves in the ES where they swing 8% one day up to, daily 3% down, these don't look good for Trump. And I'm critical of both sides, whether it was Biden, Trump, it doesn't matter to me. But when you don't have a clear, concise plan, and you don't communicate this to the public, and you're having issues with the stock market, your approval ratings are going to plummet, and they have plummeted for Trump. Even with like center right and MAGA people, they're upset about the way things are because no one likes chaos, right? And
no one likes change, yeah.
Yeah, but a change is one thing, but when you do it in such a chaotic manner without the proper messaging, it's a real big negative. And because of that, they had to rally the market these past few days to like, what is it, 55.50, which is crazy. 55.50 is like 6,000, back like 6 months ago. So I mean, we're almost at levels where it really
So,
shouldn't.
Albert, what would that proper messaging look like? Because I'm convinced that no matter what Trump did, you're going to have an antagonistic, you're going to have antagonistic Europeans, you're going to have antagonistic Chinese, you're going to have antagonistic media. So I'm convinced there's nothing he could say that would be the right messaging.
Well, I
They're
mean,
always going
real
to dismiss his messaging.
well, to a degree, I agree with you. The media is always going to go against Trump. No matter if he said the sky is blue, they're going to go argue against it,
Mm.
right?
Right.
But the timing of all this, all these trade wars and the markets going, up and down, is completely wrong, right? They had a golden opportunity to tell the people there's going to be a little bit of turmoil because of what Janet Yellen did previous, right? And that's the unbelievable amounts of debt that she laid on us so she could rally the markets for the Democrats, right? They had that time. They let that slide for whatever reason. I don't know. I'm not internal with those people at the moment, but they had that time. They could have put the market down, refinance the debt into long-term maturities, or should they have to do? They're still trying to do it, by the way, and they could have communicated that, right? And no one would have said a damn thing to Trump, right? Even if the market went down to like 4,500, no one would have said a peep because they understood that what the Democrats did beforehand was so egregious that there needs to be a rebalancing.
Do you think if Trump had said that this is Yellen's fault, that no one would push back on him?
100%. Everybody knows this.
Okay.
Literally, all of Wall Street knows this. Even some of like the center left, like hardcore hedge fund guys, were upset about what Janet Yellen was doing. Right. So it would have been a surprise to no one, and he had a golden parachute to do whatever he wanted for the first 6 months. But here we are now.
So Ralph, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think that if Trump had come out and said, this is all Yellen's fault, we have to do this stuff because it's Yellen's fault and we have to disturb markets, do you think Europeans would be less critical of Trump?
Well, I think that Albert is absolutely right on the essence. The only issue I would see with this way of communicating is that it is, for people who are not deeply involved in these issues, probably too complicated. I know this is a horrible thing to say, but long-term debt and Yellen and treasuries and long-term treasuries and yield curves including myself, by the way. I mean, this is something I only learned about over the last 24 months, and I have to admit, I'm still partially confused. So this is really something that the average person, even though I think in essence, everything that Albert said is 100% correct. But what they could have communicated, in my opinion, is that they say, listen, for a very long time during the past decades, the US economy was built primarily for profit. But what we see in other countries, China, Russia, their economies are built for purpose. So we have to take a partial page out of their book and make sure that even though profit can be beneficial, it cannot be that, for example, the US pharmaceutical industry depends 80% on Chinese imports, or that certain equipment for our military comes from China. So this has to stop. Or as you mentioned, Tony, right, that we fall behind in certain areas that are relevant for the future. This adaptation will come at a certain pain, but we can promise through our energy policies that will push oil down, and I think you're probably going to get it, to 50, through tax cuts, and also, kind of as a last point, they wouldn't call it a tribute, but they, of course, could push allies to buying long-term US bonds at whatever kind of interest rates that would be the equivalent of a tribute payment, more or less, to the United States. So I think they would have had many tools to kind of say, there will be short-term pain, but at the end of there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we might come out a little bit economically weaker, but in other areas we will be prepared for it. It's like, I don't know, as my Schwarzenegger accent gives away, you can say it's like the cutting phase before going on stage, right?
Yeah, but
it's very exhausting, but you get off like you even in better shape than before.
Yeah, but
just a second, Albert, just a second. So you think if Trump had said that Europeans would be more supportive of the actions he's taking?
they will never be supportive because the
Okay.
Europeans, in their arrogance, but it doesn't matter if Barack Obama would have done it, the Europeans would have been critical because
I don't
Europeans
think
still have
so.
not, they still have not forgiven the, chewing gum chewing, hamburger eating, soda drinking Americans that you have outpaced us in everything from the economy to innovation, to culture to entertainment and you name it. The Europeans will never forgive the Americans that. So it doesn't matter who is the president. But I think they would have understood. Like it would be easier, even pro-Trump people or those who are positively inclined towards Trump as I am, it is more difficult these days because it is like being a horse whisperer or a horse listener, if you want, when you have to tell people what you think that he actually tries to do, which he himself cannot articulate in a way that it makes sense.
Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead, Albert.
usually they have somebody like a Larry Summers, believe it or not,
Mm.
that comes out there and can actually talk more blue collar, so the general public understands. Obviously, they're not going to bring in Larry Summers because it's the wrong side of the aisle. But usually
He's
they
not
have
really well liked anymore
not
generally either,
so
right?
much really, but this is the key thing is like when you have this type of messaging, you need to have a specialized person that go out there and can go on to the circuit and tell the public this is what's happening in layman's terms, right? Not Wall Street speak that we talk, or geopolitical speak that we talk. They need layman's terms.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Peter Navarro is a terrible vehicle for this stuff.
Oh yeah.
Really unlikable. I mean, if they could do one thing differently, it's like, look, you may respect Navarro's worldview, that's fine, but keep him away from the cameras because he just comes across as surly and not very likable and angry and all this stuff. So,
Yeah,
And I think just a quick point, which is people, I'm sure, are willing to make sacrifices. The problem is if you tell them no sacrifices will be necessary, and then they are, right? If you say everything is going to be fine, and then it isn't. If you say there will be a period of pain, I think this is politicians generally, I believe, these days underestimate the willingness if you explain why something might be painful for a certain amount of time. People are willing if they see the reasoning behind it.
so I will tell you, I do watch the press conferences in the Oval Office probably 3 times a week. And they have said for at least 2 months that there will be pain. So I think part of this is it's just like when Trump said, we're going to dial down the tariffs on China, and people said, oh, he caved. You actually have to listen to the whole press conference, right? And, them saying there will be some pain. You have to listen to the whole press conference to be able to get that stuff. But we don't really have a media that wants to listen to the whole press conference. They want to take whatever narrative they want
Mm.
and kind of put it in there. So,
well, that's politics, right? That's
of
that's the
course,
that's
yeah, of
that's
course.
that's the fault of the conservative donors and whatnot. They should have their own media outlets to counter that, but they don't. So
Yeah.
it's the way it is.
But I'll tell you, I do think that as I said before, the biggest mistake they have is Peter Navarro going out to represent this stuff.
Yeah, I
Terrible,
agree.
terrible,
They, they,
terrible.
they need Tony Nash to go out there and start explaining things
I
to
could
people.
do it easily,
I'm sure you
easily.
could.
Yep. Okay, let's talk India, Pakistan, guys. So, Albert, you know that part of the world really well. Why don't you tell us what's going on and what happened?
Well, historically, everybody knows that the Pakistan India issue over the border has been looming for decades, right? And it's nowhere near being solved, right? On top of that, surely you have the Chinese in there mixing around because they want to restrict India's manufacturing and stability as much as possible. That's just how the world works,
So they
right?
want India to look like a geopolitical risk.
Of course, of
Yeah.
course they do, right? So of course they're going to ramp up the Pakistanis. I'm sure later on, maybe not end of this year, maybe next year, they might have another skirmish on the border between China and India. All these little things to just make India look too much of a risk. Why would you risk a war there when stable China is over here manufacturing, right? These it's nothing new. These extremists went over the border and killed, I think, like 26. Was it 26 or some number in that?
24, 25, 26,
Yeah,
somewhere in there. Yeah.
civilians, right?
Yep.
And the
Terrible.
Indians took offense to that, and they blamed Pakistan and made a few gestures to look, strong and whatnot. I mean, realistically, India would absolutely obliterate Pakistan. Their military is far superior, right?
Yeah.
However, when you have nuclear weapons, it's always a deterrent.
Sure.
Um, but I don't see this thing really escalating much more than a war of words and skirmishes on the border here and there for the next 18 to 24 months.
So one of the things we saw is India said they would no longer honor a water agreement between India and Pakistan. And that I think that is an interesting move, but also China is upstream of India for water. So is it possible that China comes and says to India, hey, Pakistan is our ally, so you have to turn the water back on, or we're going to turn the water off for you?
Yeah, but
You think
Tony,
upstream? Yeah,
Tony, don't you see that India and China are both in BRICS, and we all know that BRICS is the new alliance of the future. So how
true,
could that be? How could that be?
true. Yep. There is
Yeah.
no P in BRICS.
So I don't think that's going to happen, Tony, because the Chinese desperately need that Himalayan watershed, and I've noted for so many years that the next major war, because the Ukraine Russia thing is not a major war; it's a skirmish,
Right.
real, right?
Ongoing. Yep.
Yeah, but the next major war will be between China and India.
Okay. The other part of this is, although Modi is not as popular as he was probably 5 years ago, he's still very popular in India. And Pakistan, it doesn't have as popular of a president as India does. So, if a people are to galvanize behind somebody, I think in India, you will have people line up behind Modi and support a lot of what he does because he's still very popular.
Yeah, Modi's done well for India. I like whenever Obama and Biden want to attack Modi, he's doing something correctly, right? Him and Modi, Maloney, I mean Viktor Orban for Hungary, whatever personal issues you have, politically with Orban is neither here or there. What he's popular in his own country and he's doing things for his own country as any leader would, right?
Yeah,
And Modi especially has done, in my opinion, has done excellent for the
great.
Indian.
He's done a great job. Yep. So we have in India that is lining up more with the US, and I think Americans tend to see bilateral relationships as black and white, right? India either is or isn't a US ally.
Yeah.
And India doesn't see it that way. India sees it more as a deep acquaintanceship, I think, more than a deep alliance. Like, go ahead.
They've moved more to the United States because the counterbalance of using Russia versus China has diminished, right? And they know that China's knocking on their door, and in the future there's going to be a problem with them. So why would you not align with the most superior military in the world? That's just the reality of the situation. So that's why I think that is trended more towards the U.S. rather than trying to play this little counterbalance game that they've been doing for decades.
So it's interesting you bring up the military partnership. So we have these exercises in the Philippines right now, or they were last week, with the US leading with the Philippines. Japan was involved, Australia was involved, India was involved, and they were going into the South China Sea for some of their exercises. We also had a freedom of navigation operation by a US vessel last week in the Taiwan Strait. So, are we starting to see some coalescing around the US? And I think comparing it to NATO, which we did earlier this week on Cloak and Dagger, is probably we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. But
Yeah.
do you think we're starting to coalesce around a US alliance in Asia that includes Korea, Japan, India, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand? I don't know, but do you think that and the Philippines, of course, is that a powerful enough alliance to keep the Chinese up at night?
Oh, absolutely. It'd be devastating to the Chinese. I mean, realistically, the Japanese Navy would outdo the Chinese Navy, right? You start adding in India and Australia and the US. And it's honestly, that would be more formidable than NATO, in my opinion.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ralph. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean this is pure hypothetical speculation. I alluded to it already at the beginning. My suspicion is that on the long run, it probably will include New Zealand and Australia. But my sense is, and I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about this, that the United States is not just trying to decouple from China. My sense is that on the long run, at least under the current administration, that they pretty much try to decouple from everyone and everywhere that they are not required to be. So for example, take something like Taiwan. I mean, Trump said it once, and I think that was correct. It's absurd that U.S. industry depends on inputs from a small island off the coast of China. That from a strategic point of view, that's an absurd condition. It's an absurd situation. So just as the Chinese try to get independent from Taiwanese, high quality semiconductors, I think the United States will do the same. Can hypothetically, it's a question to you guys, can the United States hypothetically defend Taiwan? I think it's trickier because supply routes would be shorter for the Chinese. As far as I know, Taiwan depends on what, like 80% of their energy needs are covered by energy imports. They pursued pretty much the same stupid energy policy as the Germans did, only that they're an island next to an antagonistic neighbor. And the American, I mean, this is just my sense, the American model that I probably also projecting because I think it's cool to say you have from the southern tip of South America to the Arctic up north, like one increasingly integrated economic sphere that is rich in resources, rich in human capital, rich in water, rich in arable land. To be quite honest, do you still need a US Navy that is capable to bestride the entire globe? Again, I love they got free protection from the United States was awesome, but from the perspective of Washington, is it still necessary if you can have everything you need for a high living standard and a wealthy population in your own backyard? Do you really want to depend on Taiwan? Do you really want to depend on
Do you
Ukraine?
guys have 2 more hours?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because you start dabbling into what's necessary and for necessary for your own society to function, and then what is necessary to hold leverage against your adversaries in the future, right? They're disconnected in reality.
Yeah.
Do we need Taiwan? No, we don't. Right? We don't need them. Can we
I
defend
think
Taiwan? Sure, we can defend Taiwan. We can
Yeah.
We don't even need to defend Taiwan entirely. We just needed to make it extremely painful for the Chinese military to conquer. That's the only thing we need.
yeah. So the
Yeah,
first
but
chain,
just can I make one quick point? I agree with that, but I think if you and I again, this is not a disagreement, but sometimes I'm wondering, it's a little bit odd if you want to communicate to the American public, if you listen to what's said in the press. So the United States are supposed, I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect, but they're supposed to threaten Russia with war over a conflict, with few exceptions. Take Crimea, for example, which is a territory that is 80% Russian. The same with Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan is a separate political entity, but the people there are still Chinese. So it seems very odd to say American boys are supposed to potentially die for Chinese fighting Chinese and Ukrainians and Russians fighting over Russian territory.
wait, that's like saying half of the people in Massachusetts are Irish, so we shouldn't necessarily have Massachusetts as a part of our union.
No, it's
Just
politically.
because somebody's ethnically Chinese doesn't mean that they're politically Chinese. And I spent a lot of time in Taiwan. I've met with former Taiwan presidents. I used to consult with the Taiwanese government. And so does the US need Taiwan? Yes. Why? The first island chain. Okay. So in the same way the US needed those NATO countries to offset Russia during the Cold War, the US needs the first island chain to offset China. So
Okay, but what's the
Korea,
just
sorry, Ralph,
that's
from
sorry.
Korea to Japan to Taiwan down to Philippines, and then you jump to Australia, that's basically a castle wall that the US can use to its advantage. And
Yeah,
speaking to your point, can the US defend Taiwan? All Taiwan really needs to do is handle the first 48 hours. After that, you have Japan, you have the US, you have forces from Korea and other stuff who will come in and support Taiwan. So is Taiwan going to be left on its own? No. Is it important? Yes, because it's a part of that first island chain. So would the US have defended, Austria during the Cold War? Absolutely. Are we ethnically, are we Austrians living in the US? No,
Tony,
but
No,
we
but
would have defended them.
respectfully, the official name of Taiwan is the Republic of China. So they even have it in their name. So the official name of Austria was never the Republic of Russia. So to say that Austrians and Russians are as similar or as different as the Taiwanese and the Chinese, there's a political difference, I grant you that.
There's
But
a
the
lot of history.
reason,
I mean, we could spend hours talking about this. There's a lot of history there, and the history of Taiwan is a very specific one, and
sure,
the history of U.S. Taiwan relations are very deep.
yeah, we can
and
we can
I'm
we
not
can
denying that.
yeah, we're getting a little sidetracked here and like the political intricacies between different areas and conflict and whatnot. But what Ralph did mention was having American soldiers die on foreign soil, right? Politically, that's just after the Vietnam War, it's political suicide to send American troops into areas without a very very justified reason, like 9/11 and whatnot, right? Um, again, this Pacific NATO is surely needed. It's absolutely needed to be able to hold down China and suppress them. I mean, this is just the way the world works. Unfortunately, the United States is a superpower, and it needs to remain a superpower,
Yeah.
right? And to do that, you have to press down on adversaries. China being number one adversary to the United States, and allowing Taiwan to just fall would be not only endangering allies in the area, but like long term trust in the United States defensive umbrella. It's just the way it is, and unfortunately, we can't just sit there and be anti-interventionist across the world if we want to maintain that superpower status. If we want to have the best trade deals, and this is what I got onto the Europeans for decades. It's like if you want the best trade deals in emerging markets, you need to have military there to sway those deals towards your countries.
And they don't have it.
And
So
then,
one last distinction I'll make is defending Taiwan is not the same as invading China. Okay. Nobody wants to invade the mainland. So the difference is China sees Taiwan as part of the mainland. The US and as Trump is about, I'm sure in the next few months, about to unveil a trade deal with Taiwan, that approaches respecting Taiwan as a nation state. So the US defending Taiwan is not the same as invading, continental Asia, right? It's not the same as invading the mainland. And
and,
so,
and really, it's highly doubtful that U.S. soldiers would be on the ground anyways. It would just be U.S. armaments, maybe naval assets here and there, but it would
yeah,
not be Americans fighting with Taiwanese on the ground.
right. And the other part is this. Just to invade Iwo Jima during World War II, the US lost something like 60,000 soldiers, right? So invading Taiwan, which is also an island,
A
uh,
mountain island,
sorry,
a mountainous island
a
too.
mountainous island. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. The PLA would lose probably 500,000 soldiers or more.
it's untenable.
Um,
Politically, it's
yeah,
untenable.
it's untenable. China cannot invade Taiwan and take it because they'd lose at least 500,000 soldiers. And we've talked about it many times how it's just politically untenable to do. So it's an impossible situation. It's an intractable conflict. And I just don't see it as something that will
Well, one
find a
of these days,
resolution.
us three will just do an entire Taiwan
Yeah,
China
we should. Exactly.
podcast because it's
We
it's
should.
it's it's a it's a firestorm.
Yep.
To be clear, I'm not advocating for anything, but my sense remains, and this is just as somebody who's abroad, you guys are in the country, that over the last decades, and I think also into the future, that American appetite for, and I'm not saying that's the right strategy. I think this is just
Yeah.
the political issue that the appetite of the American electorate to take responsibility in places that appear for many people to be very far away, I think is declining. As I said, this is not
Of
something I'm advocating; it's something I'm
Of
acknowledging.
course. Oh no, of course. You can see it. I mean, even Trump hiring Tulsi Gabbard was a head nod towards that line of thinking. I do not like it, to be honest with you. I think that the United States needs to intervene in many countries
Agreed.
around the world, right? But
Yeah.
you're right. The political sentiment for intervention has substantially dropped.
Yes. Regardless, I think it would be tough to stop a defense of Taiwan because of the sentiment around that first island chain and because of the necessary, maintenance of it. I think it'd be hard. So, but we can have a much longer discussion about that, guys. Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday night for this. Um,
Anytime.
I know you're in an undisclosed location in a Chinese manufacturing site or something. So, Albert, thanks for taking the time on a Saturday. Guys, thanks very much. I really appreciate this.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, Ralph.